What would you do if the school bully who tormented you every day finally pushed too far, but this time, you were ready? Callum Bailey had learned to keep his head down. In the small town of Ashford, Georgia, being different was like carrying a target on your back. And Callum was different. He was the only black student in a school filled with kids who had never been taught to question the world around them. From the moment he stepped into Ashford High, the stairs told him everything he needed to know. He wasn't welcome. But the worst of them all was Jed Carmichael, the sheriff's son. Tall, broad-shouldered, and raised to believe that no one could touch him. He wasn't just a bully, he was the kind of person who made sure you never forgot your place. At first, the bullying was subtle. A shove in the hallway. A foot stuck out to trip him. A cruel joke whispered just loud enough for Callum to hear. But as weeks turned into months, the attacks escalated. Jed and his group of friends made sure Callum knew that no matter what he did, he would always be alone. One afternoon, in the crowded cafeteria, the inevitable happened. Callum was carrying his lunch tray, carefully navigating through the maze of tables, when Jed stepped right in front of him. "Watch where you're going, boy," Jed sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Before Callum could react, Jed's hand shot out, knocking the tray from his hands. Food splattered across the floor, the noise echoing through the silent cafeteria. A wave of laughter followed, filling the room like a storm. Callum felt the heat of humiliation creep up his neck. His fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. He knew better than to fight back. Jed smirked. "Oh, look, he's gonna cry." Something inside Callum twisted, but he forced himself to stay still. He bent down to pick up his tray, ignoring the stinging in his eyes. But then he heard it, his father's voice in his head. "Never let them break you." Callum exhaled slowly, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He met Jed's gaze, but this time, he didn't look away. There was no fear in his eyes. Just a quiet, burning fire. For the first time, Jed hesitated. It was only for a second, but Callum saw it. And in that moment, he knew, this wasn't over. That evening, Callum sat in silence at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly pushing the food around on his plate. The humiliation from lunch still clung to him like a weight pressing against his chest. His father, Major Jacob Bailey, sat across from him, watching in silence. Jacob Bailey wasn't an ordinary man. He was a legend, one of the few who had served in Delta Force, the elite military unit that handled the missions no one talked about. His presence alone was enough to command respect. He had the kind of calm, controlled demeanor that came from years of surviving the worst situations imaginable. But at home, he was just Callum's father. A man who expected discipline, but who also understood the world in ways most people never could. After a long stretch of silence, Jacob finally spoke. "Something happened today," he said. It wasn't a question. Callum hesitated, his grip tightening around his fork. "It's nothing." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Nothing doesn't make you lose your appetite." Callum sighed and set his fork down. "It's Jed Carmichael," he admitted. "He's been messing with me since I started at Ashford High. Today was just worse." Jacob leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "And what did you do?" Callum hesitated. "I walked away." A slow nod. His father didn't look disappointed, but he also didn't look satisfied. "Smart move," Jacob said. "Most of the time, walking away is the best option. But not always." Something in his father's tone made Callum frown. "What do you mean?" Jacob exhaled, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. "You can't control how people treat you, son. The world isn't fair. Some people will see you as a threat before you even open your mouth. Others will test you, just to see if you'll break." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Callum's. "What you can control is how you respond. And if a day comes when walking away isn't an option, you need to be ready. Callum swallowed hard. Ready for what? His father stood up and pushed his chair back. Come with me. Curiosity flickered through Callum's frustration as he followed his father out the back door and into the cool night air. The backyard led to an old storage building, a structure that had been there since before Callum was born. He had never thought much about it. Jacob unlocked the door and stepped inside. When Callum followed, his eyes widened. The place wasn't a storage shed at all, it was a training space. Punching bags hung from the ceiling. A wooden dummy stood in the corner, covered in years of knife marks. Ropes, mats, and weights filled the room, but what caught Callum's attention the most was the wall lined with framed medals and photographs. Photos of his father, standing with other soldiers, in full combat gear, holding weapons Callum couldn't even name. Jacob walked to the center of the room and gestured for Callum to follow. This, he said, is where you're going to learn. Callum felt a mix of excitement and uncertainty. Learn what? His father turned to face him, his expression serious. How to fight. But more importantly, how to win. Callum hesitated. I don't want to be like Jed. Jacob gave a small nod of approval. Good. That means you'll use what I teach you wisely. He stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Callum's shoulder. Fighting isn't about revenge. It's not about proving you're better than someone else. It's about survival. It's about making sure that when someone doesn't let you walk away, you're the one who gets to go home in one piece. A long silence stretched between them before Jacob finally stepped back. Take off your shoes, he instructed. We start now. Callum hesitated for only a moment before obeying. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had a choice. And he chose to be ready. The first few weeks of training were brutal. Callum had always thought of himself as in decent shape. He played basketball occasionally, ran laps in gym class, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer intensity of his father's regimen. It started with endurance. Jacob had him running drills every morning before school, pushing his body further than it had ever gone before. Sprints, push-ups, planks, burpees, every session left Callum drenched in sweat, his muscles screaming for relief. But he didn't complain. His father wasn't the kind of man who entertained weakness. This is the foundation, Jacob told him as Callum gasped for air after finishing a grueling round of sprint intervals. You can't fight if you can't last. Then came the technique. His father didn't just teach him how to punch, he taught him how to strike with purpose. How to hit hard, efficiently, without wasting energy. How to read an opponent's movements, anticipate their next attack before they made it. Most people don't know how to fight, Jacob explained as he circled Callum in the training space, watching his form. They throw wild punches, hoping something lands. You're not going to be like them. You're going to hit where it matters. And when you hit, you're going to make it count. Callum learned fast. His father drilled him on the basics, footwork, balance, positioning. He taught him how to shift his weight properly when throwing a punch, how to stay light on his feet. And then, when Callum thought he was getting the hang of it, his father introduced the grappling techniques. This isn't a boxing match, Jacob said, demonstrating how to break free from a chokehold. You're not trying to go 10 rounds. If someone comes at you, your goal is to neutralize the threat as fast as possible. Callum quickly realized that fighting wasn't just about strength. It was about control. Timing. Precision. And for the first time in his life, he started to feel powerful. But even as his body adapted to the training, the real test still waited for him, at school. It had been nearly a month since the cafeteria incident, and things had been relatively quiet. Jed still made his presence known, but he hadn't tried anything since that day. Instead, he had taken to watching Callum from a distance, eyes filled with a simmering resentment. Callum knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated again. And he was right. It happened after gym class. Callum had just finished changing in the locker room when he turned a corner and found himself face to face with Jed and two of his friends. They blocked the hallway, arms crossed, a slow grin spreading across Jed's face. "You think you're tough now, huh?" Jed sneered. Callum's heartbeat quickened, but he didn't let it show. He had trained for this. He knew better than to react emotionally. "I don't think anything," he replied coolly. "I just want to get to class." Jed chuckled, stepping forward. "See, that's the problem. You think you can just walk around like you belong here. Like you're one of us." He spat the last word with disgust. "But you're not." Callum's jaw clenched, but he stayed calm. He had learned patience from his father: never let an opponent bait you into a fight on their terms. One of Jed's friends, a stocky kid named Travis, shoved Callum's shoulder. "Say something, tough guy." Callum barely moved from the push. His body was stronger now, more stable. "I don't need to," he said simply. Jed's grin faltered for just a second, but then he scoffed. "You're scared." Callum met his eyes. "No. I'm just not stupid." For the first time, Jed didn't have an immediate comeback. There was something different about Callum now, something that made him hesitate. Before, Callum would have looked away, avoided conflict. But not anymore. After a few seconds, Jed clicked his tongue in irritation and shook his head. "You're not worth my time." He turned and walked past Callum, pushing his shoulder as he passed. Callum let out a slow breath as he watched them disappear down the hallway. He hadn't thrown a single punch. But he had still won. The night air was crisp as Callum walked home from a late study session at the library. His father had always told him to stay aware of his surroundings, so even as he kept his eyes on the dimly lit path ahead, he listened, really listened, to the world around him. The rustling of leaves, the distant hum of passing cars, the chirping of crickets. Then, something changed. The crickets stopped. The air felt heavier, charged. A sound, footsteps, faint but deliberate, echoed behind him. Callum's pulse quickened, but he didn't stop walking. His father's lessons played in his head like a mantra: don't freeze. Assess the threat. Stay calm. He turned the corner onto the shortcut through the wooded path behind the school. That's when he heard it: more footsteps. Faster now. More than one person. He knew what this was before he even looked. Callum exhaled and came to a stop. "Finally figured it out, huh?" Jed Carmichael's voice dripped with amusement, but underneath it was something darker, something eager. Callum turned slowly. Jed stood a few feet away, flanked by Travis and another guy Callum didn't recognize. They weren't smiling. They weren't playing games this time. "Guess you thought you got one over on me the other day," Jed said, rolling his shoulders like a boxer preparing for a fight. "Made me look bad. Made me hesitate." He spat on the ground. "I don't hesitate twice." Callum's muscles tensed, but he forced himself to stay still. "You don't have to do this," he said evenly. Jed smirked. "Oh, I do. See, you don't get to just walk around like you belong here. And you sure as hell don't get to make me look weak." Travis took a step forward, a baseball bat dangling from his grip. Callum's heartbeat thudded like a war drum. 3 of them. 1 of me. 1 weapon. Tight space. Limited movement. His father's voice whispered in his mind, "You're never outnumbered if you control the fight." Jed moved first, a lazy swing, testing, not attacking. Callum didn't react. He let them feel in control. Let them believe he was scared. "Look at him," the third guy chuckled. "Bet he's about to run." Callum didn't run. He saw it before it happened, the slight shift in Jed's stance, the tightening of his fists. That was all the warning he needed. Jed lunged, throwing a punch meant to rattle Callum's skull. But Callum wasn't there. He sidestepped, fast and sharp, and before Jed could recover, Callum's fist drove into his ribs with the force of weeks of training behind it. Jed grunted, stumbling back, shock flashing across his face. But there was no time to savor it. Travis swung the bat. Callum dropped low, the bat whistling through the air just inches from his head. As Travis overextended, Callum surged forward, using his entire body weight to slam his shoulder into the bigger boy's gut. Travis crashed into the dirt with a choked gasp. The third guy hesitated. That was all Callum needed. He turned on him in a blink, fists raised, body loose and ready. The guy took one look at Jed, gasping for breath, and at Travis, groaning on the ground, and suddenly, he didn't look so confident. "You crazy, man," he muttered, stepping back. "Then leave," Callum said. His voice was steady. He wasn't out of breath. He wasn't scared. He was in control. The guy bolted. Jed, still holding his ribs, stared at Callum like he was seeing him for the first time. "This ain't over," he spat, but there was no weight behind the words. No real conviction. Callum didn't move, didn't say a word as he watched Jed stagger to his feet, grab Travis by the arm, and retreat into the night. Then, finally, when they were gone, Callum let out a slow breath. His fists relaxed. He had won. Not just the fight, but the war. Callum's knuckles ached the next morning, a dull reminder of the fight. His ribs were sore, and there was a faint bruise forming on his forearm where he had blocked Travis's bat. But none of it mattered. What mattered was that he had walked away. He had won. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel powerless. He didn't feel like prey. He had stood his ground, and Jed had run. But he knew it wasn't over. As he walked through the halls of Ashford High, heads turned. Whispers followed him, students murmuring in hushed voices. Word had spread fast. No one knew the details, but everyone knew something had happened. At lunch, Callum sat alone as usual. But today felt different. The usual stares of pity had been replaced with something else. Something closer to respect. Then, a shadow fell over his table. He looked up to see Jed Carmichael standing there, his face tight with barely contained rage. His lip was swollen, his stance tense. He hadn't come alone. Travis and a couple of other guys stood behind him, but none of them looked eager for another fight. Callum didn't stand. He didn't have to. Jed leaned in, voice low. "You think this changes anything?" Callum held his gaze. "I think it changes everything." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jed did something unexpected. He straightened, glancing around the cafeteria, then back at Callum. He smirked. "Enjoy it while it lasts," he said. "You got lucky." But Callum saw the truth in his eyes. It wasn't luck, and you know it. Jed turned and walked away, his crew following. Callum exhaled, steadying himself. He knew what had just happened. Jed wasn't done with him, not completely. But he had lost control. The days of pushing Callum around without consequences were over. As Callum finished his lunch, he caught a few people still looking at him, some with curiosity, others with something that almost looked like admiration. For the first time, he didn't feel invisible. And for the first time, he wasn't just enduring his life. He was living it. That evening, Callum sat at the dining table, rolling his aching wrist absent-mindedly. His father watched him from across the room, arms folded, expression unreadable. "You had a fight," Jacob finally said. Callum looked up, his jaw tightening. "They jumped me." Jacob nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "And?" Callum hesitated. He wasn't sure what his father was looking for. A confession? An apology? "I handled it," he said at last. For a long moment, Jacob said nothing. Then, to Callum's surprise, a small smile tugged at the corner of his father's mouth. "That so?" Jacob stood up and walked over to the kitchen counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Tell me how." Callum straightened in his chair. "Jed had 2 guys with him. One had a bat. I waited for an opening, took Jed out first, then neutralized the guy with the weapon. The third ran before I had to do anything." Jacob took a slow sip of coffee, then set the mug down. "No hesitation." "No," Callum said, surprising even himself with how certain he sounded. Jacob nodded approvingly. "Good." Callum frowned. "That's it?" Jacob smirked. "You expected a lecture." Callum hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe." Jacob exhaled, walking over to the table and sitting down across from him. "Son, I trained you to survive. Not to fight for fun, not to prove a point. But because one day, someone was going to test you." He leaned forward slightly. "And when that day came, you'd have 2 choices, fold, or stand your ground." Callum met his father's gaze. "I stood my ground." Jacob's smirk grew slightly. "Damn right you did." Callum felt a swell of pride in his chest, but his father wasn't done. "But don't let this go to your head," Jacob warned. "You won today, but winning one fight doesn't mean the war is over. This is where boys mess up, they think one victory makes them invincible." He tapped his fingers against the table. "You think Jed's just gonna let this go?" Callum exhaled. "No." "Then be ready." Jacob's voice hardened. "You sent a message." "Good. But now he's going to try to send one back. You need to be prepared for whatever comes next." Callum nodded. "I will be." Jacob studied him for a moment longer, then finally leaned back, satisfied. "Good," he said simply. Then, after a pause, he added, "I'm proud of you." Callum blinked, his throat tightening. His father didn't hand out praise easily. "Thanks, Dad." Jacob stood, grabbing his mug. "Finish your dinner. You've earned it." For the first time in a long time, Callum felt something shift inside him. He had come out of the fight not just stronger, but more confident. He had faced his fears, fought back, and survived. But his father was right. This wasn't over. Not yet. The next few weeks passed in an uneasy silence. Callum knew better than to believe it was over. People like Jed didn't let things go, they bided their time, waited for the right moment to strike back. And that's exactly what worried him. At school, things felt different. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they had changed. The looks people gave him weren't pitying anymore. Some of them were even respectful. Others wary. But the most telling thing of all, Jed kept his distance. For the first time since Callum had come to Ashford High, he wasn't being tripped in the hallways. His locker wasn't mysteriously jammed shut. No one knocked his books out of his hands. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like waiting for a storm to break. Callum didn't let his guard down. He kept training. Every morning before school, he ran his drills. Every evening, he worked through the techniques his father had drilled into him. And every night, he reminded himself, be ready. The attack came when he least expected it. It was late, well past dark, when he stepped out of the community center after a volunteer shift. He had been helping some of the younger kids with their schoolwork, something his mother had always encouraged him to do. It had been a good night, one of the first in a long time where he wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder. That was a mistake. The parking lot was nearly empty. Callum was halfway across it when he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Not just one set. Multiple. He turned, instinct screaming at him, just in time to see Jed and 3 other guys stepping out of the shadows. This wasn't like before. Jed wasn't smirking. He wasn't playing games. His eyes burned with something colder. More calculated. You thought you could embarrass me? Jed's voice was low, controlled. You thought I'd just let you get away with it? Callum's muscles coiled, ready. You got a problem with me, Jed? Jed took another step forward, cracking his knuckles. Yeah. You're still breathing. The first punch came fast. But Callum was faster. He shifted just enough to let the fist brush past his face, then countered with a sharp jab to Jed's ribs. The impact forced Jed back, but before Callum could press his advantage, the other guys moved. One grabbed his arm, Callum twisted, breaking the hold and driving his elbow back into the guy's stomach. Another came from the side with a wild swing, Callum ducked, his knee shooting up into the attacker's gut. 2 down. But Jed was still there. And this time, he wasn't alone. Something hard slammed into Callum's side, pain exploded through his ribs as he stumbled back, barely catching himself. One of the guys had brought a pipe. They came here to do real damage. Callum's mind raced. He couldn't take them all at once, not like this. He needed to move. Needed to end this before it got worse. Jed lunged again, swinging wild. Callum sidestepped, using the momentum against him. He grabbed Jed's wrist, twisting hard, forcing him off balance before driving his foot into the back of his knee. Jed hit the ground with a grunt, but before Callum could finish it, the guy with the pipe moved again. This time, Callum wasn't fast enough. The pipe connected with his shoulder. White-hot pain shot down his arm, but he gritted his teeth, pushing through. He couldn't let them break him. Not now. He surged forward, blocking out the pain, ducking under the next swing and slamming his fist into the attacker's throat. The guy staggered back, choking. That left Jed. The other 2 were down. He was alone. Callum straightened, breathing hard, his body screaming in protest, but he didn't waver. Jed scrambled back to his feet, panting. For the first time, Callum saw it. Fear. You lost, Callum said, voice steady. Jed's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't move. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, slowly, Jed took a step back. Then another. He glanced at his fallen friends, then back at Callum. Without another word, he turned and ran. Callum watched them go, his body aching, adrenaline still surging through his veins. It was over. For real this time. Jed had thrown everything he had at him. Had tried to break him. And he had failed. Callum sat on the edge of his bed, carefully rotating his sore shoulder. The bruises from the fight were already darkening, the ache settling deep into his muscles. He had won, but his body was reminding him of the cost. His father stood in the doorway, watching him with that familiar unreadable expression. I heard what happened, Jacob finally said. Callum didn't bother denying it. He knew his father had his ways of finding things out. Jacob stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the bruises, the stiffness in Callum's movements. How bad? I'll live, Callum said, trying to sound casual. Jacob huffed, shaking his head. Damn right you will. He sat down across from him, elbows resting on his knees. Jed ran, Callum said simply. They all did. A slow nod. His father leaned back slightly, considering. That was the last time. Callum frowned. How do you know? Jacob's lips curled into a smirk. Because you beat him after he stacked the odds in his favor. He went all in and still lost. He tilted his head. A bully can't survive without fear. You took that from him. Callum thought about that for a moment. He had felt it, seen it, in Jed's eyes. That last, fleeting moment of fear before he turned and ran. It hadn't just been about the fight. It had been about control. And Jed had lost it. A strange sense of relief washed over Callum, heavier than he expected. It really was over. His father studied him for a moment longer before nodding to himself. "Good," he said. Then, after a pause, "Proud of you, son." Callum's chest tightened. His father had said it before, but somehow, this time, it felt different. It felt final. Like something had shifted between them. "Thanks, Dad." Jacob stood, stretching. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, training resumes." Callum blinked. "Training? I thought." Jacob smirked. "You thought I only trained you to fight Jed Carmichael?" "No, son. I trained you for life." And just like that, the conversation was over. His father left the room, leaving Callum sitting there, the words still settling over him. For the first time in a long time, Callum felt whole. He had fought back. Had survived. Had won. And now? Now, he was ready for whatever came next. Years later, Callum stood in front of a group of kids, their young faces eager but uncertain. The small training gym wasn't much, just a few punching bags, a couple of mats, and a handful of worn-out gloves, but it was his. "Fighting isn't about proving you're the strongest," Callum said, his voice steady. "It's about knowing when to stand your ground. About choosing to fight only when you have to." He scanned the room, seeing a younger version of himself in some of their eyes, the ones who had been pushed around, who had felt powerless. "You won't leave here looking for fights," he continued. "But if one finds you, you'll be ready." A small boy in the front row, no older than 12, raised his hand. "Did you ever get beat up?" Callum chuckled, thinking back to those long months of training, the fights, the bruises, the pain. "I lost plenty," he admitted. "But I never stayed down." The boy nodded, satisfied. Callum clapped his hands together. "All right. Let's get started." As the kids moved into position, Callum stepped onto the mat with them. This wasn't just about fighting. This was about giving them what his father had given him. Strength. Confidence. The ability to never feel powerless again. This story isn't just about fighting, it's about transformation. Callum's journey from a victim to a warrior is proof that strength isn't just physical, it's mental, emotional, and deeply personal. He didn't just defeat Jed, he conquered fear, self-doubt, and the belief that he was powerless. What makes this story powerful isn't that Callum learned how to throw a punch. It's that he learned when not to throw one. He didn't let revenge consume him. He didn't become the thing he fought against. Instead, he took his pain, his struggle, and turned it into something meaningful. The true victory wasn't in the fight, it was in what he did after. He took what he had learned and passed it on, making sure that the next generation didn't have to learn the hard way. Callum's story is one of resilience, of breaking cycles, and of choosing strength over fear. And in the end, that's what truly makes him a warrior.